Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, a new Congress faces a new year, but some of the same old environmental issues. We'll take a special look at the major questions, including coastal erosion, levee protection, and the impact of the oil spill. The City Council will be considering the environment inside bar rooms as it takes a contested vote about smoking bans. And the third phase of the BP trial begins this Tuesday. We'll look at what to expect. We'll also examine the impact of construction projects during Mardi Gras, the latest on a parish president's sexual battery trial, and our Future Watch segment looks for the score in the city's efforts to attract big-name sporting events. Starting for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Richard Thompson, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate; Don Ostrom, our Future Watch reporter; and Mark Schlefstein, reporter, NOLA.com, and the Times-Picayune. And we're going to go first over to Richard, and a couple of things happening with the whole BP issue and the oil spill. Federal Judge Barbies made an important decision that he announced yesterday, and then we have this upcoming trial starting on Tuesday. Why don't you describe to us what's going on?
Well, starting Tuesday will be the third phase of the BP trial, which is almost coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the accident. And so the first phase was designed to try to assign liability for the accident. The second phase, which occurred later in 2013, set out to talk about what happened from the moment the well blew out to when it was capped, and to try to decide how much oil actually was released out of the well and into the Gulf. And so this third phase coming up next week will be the penalty phase, to decide how much BP and its minority partner Anadarko should pay in Clean Water Act penalties for their role in the spill.
So what the judge announced yesterday, regarding the amount of oil spilled, could you sort of describe what happened there and who's happy about it and who isn't?
Well, the ruling that came yesterday was Judge Barbies' ruling from phase 2 of the trial. And so he found that from almost 2 weeks of testimony that about 3.2 barrels of oil, which is
million barrels.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
3.2 barrels, which is about 134 million gallons of oil, had escaped from the well. And so that's important because that number is going to be what is used to determine how much BP could end up paying in Clean Water Act penalties. And so by using that, going back to phase 1, the judge had ruled that BP was had acted with willful misconduct and was grossly negligent for their role in the disaster. And so that ups the amount that they could pay in these penalties. And so now they're facing almost $13.2 billion upward. That's the high end of the scale for these Clean Water Act fines.
So this amount of oil that the judge found was spilled into the Gulf, the 3.2 million, barrels, which equates to the 134 million gallons. Is that what the feds were estimating? Because the more that is found to have been spilled in the Gulf, the larger the amount of money in the fines.
That's actually a little bit less than what the federal government was pushing, a little bit more than what BP was pushing. It's almost right in the middle between the two figures. And
so then what are the feds estimating should be, or thinking, or saying that should be the fine per barrel? Isn't there a dollar figure per barrel, and that really equates to this big, gigantic figure?
Well, if going by the Fed's original estimate on how much oil had been released from the well, it would have been a figure that was close to $18 billion that they could have paid in Clean Water Act penalties. And according to the pretrial briefs that were filed, they were pushing for as close to that figure as possible. BP is going to try to make the case in the next few weeks during this third phase that their response and the money that they've paid at that time was so much that that should be taken into consideration, and they should be able to get some, the Clean Water Act fine should be a lot less given how much they've already paid. And right now they're facing almost about $42 billion, not counting anything they pay here for costs tied to the spill.
So, so that's what we're going to be hearing next week in the arguments then, is just exactly what kind of dollar amount should be assigned to the barrels spilled?
Essentially, the arguments are going to be focused on the federal government's going to say that this was the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history, and BP should pay the maximum that is within this spectrum. BP is going to say, well, we did so good with the response, and we poured all this money into it already, and all these man hours, and hired so many people. Cut us some slack. We've paid the cost. We've learned our lesson. There should be a fine, but not nearly that much.
Well, it seems like the judge set a precedent with his ruling on the government said this many barrels and BP said that many, and he met them in the middle. You think that's what might happen with this next phase too? A little meeting in the middle?
It could be. I think. I mean, the federal government sounded within the briefs that it was willing to give BP a little bit of leeway. At that point, when they thought it could have been $18 billion, they said they should pay no less than $16 billion. So it's possible now with them facing about 13, maybe they're in somewhere in the range of 10.
Yeah, there's a list of 8 issues that the judge has to address during this phase. There are 8 individual things that the Clean Water Act says the judge has to have an answer to that include whether or not the company's finances were affected, how much ability it put into cleaning up and things like that. Once he goes through all those, he then has to assign a percentage for each of those and set it compared to the maximum fine per barrel, which is $4,300 because of the additional liability that he's added to the company. So that'll reduce it significantly.
Let me ask either one of you, what do we know about how strong BP is? I mean, can BP withstand a major fine?
Well, according to your reaction, I would say they could.
I mean, they've made the case in some of these pretrial briefs that due to the price of oil dropping so dramatically over the past 6 months, that it would be a much more dire hit if they were hit with this maximum fine now than it would have been maybe a year ago. But they could still withstand a payment of this type. I mean, they've done a lot of divesting in the last few years since this spill. They've kind of got some reserve set to be able to cushion that, I think.
And also, real quick, and I want to move from BP, but also you reported this week about this U.S. Supreme Court not agreeing to hear BP appeal.
Yep, that was actually a couple of weeks ago. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear their appeal on the economic settlement, and so BP and Judge Barbier. BP has been trying to second guess Judge Barbier in a lot of ways to the Fifth Circuit and continually appealing different aspects of the settlement, and this was just one of them. So their decision basically settles the question of whether or not it's a valid deal.
So the settlement goes, it stays now, that's it.
At least the settlement stays, yeah.
Okay, all righty. Mark, over to you. In talking about BP, what we want to talk to you about is our coast and coastal restoration and levee protection, et cetera, and how we're standing now. But just BP has a big part in that with this fine.
Very, very much so, and indeed, the state now hopes to rely on a lot of the money that will be coming out of the BP fines. About 80% of the Clean Water Act fine money that the judge determines that BP will pay will end up going to what's called the Restore Act. And maybe as much as a third of that money would come to the state of Louisiana for specific projects that would be approved. The state's already, that fund already has some money in it, about $1 billion or so, that will be allocated over the next year or so that comes out of criminal fines that BP's already paid. And so the state has all of these plans. It's basically using its master plan, a coastal master plan, which includes actually $50 billion worth of levee and coastal restoration projects over 50 years. And it's using projects that it's judiciously pulling out of there that match the requirements of, restoring things for what happened in BP, and is proposing to put the money into those. So
what is the state wishing for, or hoping for, in terms of fines as it factors into that master plan implementation?
Again, what it's looking for is about a third of the fine money, a third of the 80%. So
is there a dollar figure?
They've come up with a bit more realistic idea of what the judge may end up doing, and their assumption is that final figure will be $8 to $10 billion, somewhere around there, and so they'll get about a third of that for that. But remember that there's also another piece of this puzzle that hasn't been issued yet, that is not part of this trial, and that is what's called the natural resource damage assessment process. under the Oil Pollution Act, BP also has to pay for damages to natural resources in the context of paying for projects to restore those damages. That could be an amount that some people believe would be equal to whatever it pays in the Clean Water Act funds.
When will that be resolved? Do you think?
Who knows?
Yeah, who knows when any of this will be
it's
resolved.
actually moving comparatively quickly, but we're probably at least a year or two away before we figure out what kind of money we're talking about and what actually that money would be used for.
So let's talk about coastal restoration and levee protection. How are we looking now?
Well, you know, the problem that the state is facing is rather significant, and it's been occurring fairly rapidly over the last 75 years. But the reality is that the state, through some money that it had set aside from surplus that the state had in the 2008-2009 period, actually money that came from sales tax from Katrina and things like that. It's put a lot of that money into the bank and has that money available to pay for projects that are now underway along the coast. It's also adding that to the BP money that's already out there. It's starting, it has underway the planning for a major diversion of Mississippi River sediment onto the west bank of the river. What's called the Mid-Barataria project, and then a variety of other projects that are underway. It has a lot of these projects where it's been pumping sediment that have built quite a bit of land, more land than has been built in since this whole restoration process occurred. And there's probably, you know, we're looking at least $2 to $4 billion in the next 2 or 3 years that will be available. And then you've got all that BP money that's coming in.
Are we still losing a football field a day, or whatever that statistic
that's the thing
is?
that people really need to understand. When the average now is about 16 square miles a year is what the estimate is. But the reality is that even with the state's master plan, it will be 2035 before we see, quote, no net loss of wetlands, if it were fully funded, and we still have to figure out how to fully fund it. The BP money will most definitely not be enough to pay for the $25 billion that is for restoration that's in that $50 billion plan.
So is there at least feeling, like to somebody like you who looks at these sort of things critically, that there's a plan that's workable, and the question is just the funding?
There is a plan. It seems to be workable. It is now at the point where pieces of it are at the implementation stage, and there will be fights over each individual project as they move forward because of the potential effects, for instance, on fisheries for some of the diversions.
And on communities, too.
And on communities as well.
Okay, Mark, thanks so much. We have to move over to our Future Watch segment right now, and Dawn, and sporting events. And this past year, we had some disappointments.
We've had some bad news. We've lost the 2018 Super Bowl, which would have coincided with the 300th birthday of the city. We lost a chance at the national championship college football game. The people at the Greater New Orleans Sports Foundation say, hey, wait, like we had a banner 2-3 years running in 2012, 13, and 14 with the Sugar Bowl, the NBA All-Star game, the BCS championship game, NCAA finals, WrestleMania. These things kind of happen in a pattern. The NCAA Final Four was here in 93, 2003, and 2012. They say New Orleans probably wasn't in the cycle yet for that. Same with the Super Bowl, which tends to come every 9 years or so. But we have been outbid, too. The city of Phoenix outbid the city of New Orleans by an economic margin of almost 2 to 1. Where Mark was just talking about the state funding and setting aside money for coastal restoration, sports folks are saying, please, the state legislature has never let us down. The money's always been there, but we don't, like Texas has, have a set dedicated fund that says to a city or an organization you're bidding to, we have the money, see, it's right here. We say, we will have the money. We always do. Look at our history, but we don't have the bank account to show for it. Please just trust us. So we've lost out to Minneapolis and lost out to Phoenix and some other cities. And they say, you know, look at the economics of it. A Super Bowl, for instance, the state put up $6 million. There was other money put up, but the state alone put up $6 million to get the last Super Bowl. When those numbers were turned around, the Super Bowl brought in $20 million. So it's a $15 million return on that investment. It does bring in a lot of money. We are still apparently a very competitive city. People still, sports writers across America would come here every time, I think, if they could, just because of the proximity of everything. We can host, as a city, we can host these events cheaper, partly because we have an organization called the Greater New Orleans Sports Foundation that doesn't have to be recreated every time a major event comes, with office space rented and people hired and systems put in place. Those systems are there and working full time. They just hope that at some point the legislature can say, well, we just got $15 million out of the Super Bowl. Let's set some of it aside for future events, like the state of Texas does, which continues to outbid the city of New Orleans as well. There are opportunities to bid coming up on WrestleMania again for 2017 and 18, on the college football playoff championship games for 2019 and 20, on the Super Bowl perhaps for 2019 and 20. So there are big events on the horizon. The Super Bowl is an interesting one because you have to be invited to bid on that. The other ones, you don't have to have an invitation to bid. So those bid packages come out in February for some and in May for the Super Bowl.
Errol?
I noticed the national champion college game last week, that when it was promoted, they didn't say the game was in Dallas. They said in North Texas. Even on the end zone, it said North Texas. And indeed, the stadium is not in Dallas. I think it's in Arlington, right? In the year the Saints were in the Super Bowl, they asked people where the game was, and they'll say it's Miami, but actually it was outside of Miami, and the area was referred to, I think, as West Miami. And so you see more and more of these areas pitching themselves regionally. Now, being sort of provincial about New Orleans, I respect the fact that in New Orleans, our stadium is in New Orleans. I mean, it's not outside of New Orleans, and I like the idea that's referred to as New Orleans, but you can see more and more of these communities putting together a regional package.
You might get more state buy-in that way. That's part of the problem when this idea goes before the legislature every time. You get legislators 300 miles away who say, we need some of that money back in our pockets, too.
A lot of money in North Texas,
Not pockets,
too.
I'm sorry, area.
Well, it's steady competition. Wasn't there a video and a sketch released of the new stadium for Atlanta? Was it Atlanta? And that's really going to be pretty
Atlanta will be
spectacular.
competitive.
Yeah.
There are a lot of other cities out there that have learned how lucrative these events are.
Yeah.
We aren't losing out completely, though. The women's final four is coming in 2020, and some of these other events may occur before then. And we still do have the Sugar Bowl every year. It's just not a playoff game every year.
Thanks a lot, Dawn. All right, back over to Richard. No smoking in bars. The city council's considering that.
They are. They could take a vote on it as early as next week as well. And there have been some changes to the rules so far since they've been implemented, but what's being proposed now at this point would ban smoking in all the city's bars as well as at Harrah's, the casino.
Just no smoking at all. What about outside? Is there going to be, does this ordinance, limit the space at which you can smoke outside of even a private business as well as a public business?
Well, initially the ordinance had put smokers as having to be 25 feet away from the building, which would have really been probably created some issues in the French Quarter or other areas where bars are very close together. But now they've brought it back to about 5 feet from the doors.
The argument you're hearing from some of the barroom owners are saying, well, this will kill my business if we can't have smoking in bars. Others are saying, please implement this, because if no bar can have smoking, then it's not going to kill our business. It'll actually perhaps draw business, because there are some people who stay away because they don't like to smoke.
Right, and here advocates of the measure are also going to argue that, if you want to go outside for a cigarette, you can just take your drink to go. And so it's not creating that much of an issue there either.
So it could come up for vote as early as next week?
It could, and City Councilwoman Cantrell, who has pushed the measure at the City Council, has said in the last week that she believes she has the support of her colleagues to get it through.
How about the casinos?
Well, they're against the measure, as are a lot of French Quarter bar owners as well. But it remains to be seen. That could be some ground to be gained there. But as it is right now, the measure would prevent smoking at casinos.
And some of the city council members have said they want to study what the economic impact is going to be of that.
Yeah, there have been a lot of suggestions that particularly state police had put out some numbers earlier, and the casino would advocate as well that they could see a drop in revenues if smoking's banned from people at Harrah's. And so there could, with the state receiving money from them as a result of how many people are in there gambling, there could be a dip in that too, but it still remains to be seen.
Couldn't an exemption be made for just Harrah's because it's a unique business?
It's possible. I mean, until they finally vote on this, that could be an exception that's made. There's also some talk about making an exception for users of e-cigarettes. And I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Those same arguments were once used for restaurants and the back of airplanes, and the recurring arguments, but they usually don't last.
Okay, so next week we could find out whether or not you can light up in a bar. All right, Errol, it's Mardi Gras time, but there's so much construction on Napoleon Avenue. How's that going to impact?
Yeah, every year there's been something going on, at least since Katrina. In the first few years, it was due to Katrina, and now it's just to the whole building a bigger and better drainage system. And so it's going to, and then there was also the streetcar factor for a couple of years. So there was always just something in the way. It's not going to be too bad. The main problem is going to be Napoleon Avenue. The neutral ground side of Napoleon Avenue is a very popular place to see parades because it's early in the parade route. There's a lot of room. You can run around. Well, that's going to be prohibited to most people most of the time during the parade season. Now, the other side of Napoleon Avenue, you can. I mean, so there's probably a lot of people just moved over there or around the corner to St. Charles Avenue. So that's going to be the main change. The other change is going to be, which probably affects less people, but it's part of the I guess the ballet of Mardi Gras is with Gallier Hall, that because of the construction going on in Gallier Hall from all the fallen pieces going on there, and so they're going to still allow Gallier Hall to be used for parties, but the mayor and the reception part is going to be on the other side, so that's going to be a little bit different. My impression is that Gallier Hall is not as popular as a viewing destination as it used to be, so except for the major parades at the end. So I don't know what kind of impact that's going to have. Which, one thing I'm curious about, a peek into the future, is going to be Canal Street between Galvez and Claiborne, where you see the hospital going up now. Now, for many years, and one reason that so many parades have left the Canal Street route is that that area was pretty much empty because there just wasn't a population there, and there's still not. Most of it's a construction site. It's not a construction site that's going to stop people from standing on the sidewalk. But I just wonder what the future is going to be once those, and it could be good. I mean, it could be once all those buildings are populated and people are in there. I mean, will the hospital complex be having parties for Endymion along the way? And could that just whole change the dynamics of Mardi Gras? But for right now, it's going to be sort of like a dead area during that part of the route.
So just right now, for this Mardi Gras, no plans to set up housekeeping on the neutral ground in Napoleon Avenue. I mean, we'd see people literally living there for days. And
the simple thing is avoid the neutral ground of Napoleon Avenue. Anywhere else, you should be able to find something.
Mardi Gras rolls on.
Yeah, here it comes.
Absolutely. Okay. Back over to Richard now. And St. Bernard Parish President Peralta, not a federal grand jury, a state grand jury is considering yet something else regarding President Peralta.
Right. Well, last year, President Peralta was indicted twice, once by a state grand jury in St. Bernard on a charge of sexual battery, and also by a state grand jury in St. Tammany on a charge of stalking, both involving his ex-wife and allegations that she has made. And so now, just this week in St. Bernard, we're learning that the Attorney General's office has also convened now another grand jury, which is looking into potential charges that it could include witness intimidation, malfeasance, as well as one other that is escaping me at the moment. But in terms of how those could play out or what the allegations are, specifically the AG's office is really holding the cards close to their chest. But we could start to learn more about that as the grand jury reconvenes in the next few weeks and months.
So malfeasance possible charge, I mean, that is really a very serious charge, right? That
would really be a turn for him. I mean, the first charge, neither of the two charges so far, at least what we've learned of them, involve his carrying out his job duties and his responsibilities as parish president of St. Bernard. But this would fall directly on that, and we have to see how that plays out.
And so what is President Peralta saying about all of this? Or is he saying anything? Can he even talk to the media about this?
Well, the cases in Covington and in Chalmette are both under a strict gag order from the judge, so he really hasn't said too much about it. Otherwise, though, up until now, he has still maintained that he plans to run for re-election later this year, and so far has resisted calls to resign from some parish officials and residents.
So the malfeasance, looking into a possible malfeasance charge, how does then that relate to the performance of his duties? Are they saying that parish resources were used perhaps in some sort of way?
That seems likely, though the AG's office really hasn't disclosed too much about it. In recent court hearings in St. Bernard, they have mentioned or made reference to an ongoing malfeasance investigation, but they haven't said much more than that. But certainly that is one way it could go.
I was going to say, of all the parishes, that's a parish that can use stability in government right now because it's got just a massive rebuilding job, and there's been a good bit of turnover over the last few elections. And so getting this resolved and moving on and building a government that can stabilize would be really imperative over there.
And certainly for at least a year now, you've had some people in the parish, former parish council members and others, who have kind of been watching with a close eye to see kind of what his fate is, if he would resign, when a special election could be held, and kind of just getting ready to throw their hats in the ring.
You mentioned that one of the cases is in St. Tammany Parish. Does that have a chance of perhaps being moved back over to St. Bernard?
There's been some talk about it, but it sounds like that will stay in St. Tammany at this point. And the judges in each case in the last few weeks have also set trial dates. I believe the case in St. Tammany could come to trial maybe in April or May, and the one in St. Bernard could be tried by the beginning of March.
All right, Richard, thanks a lot. All right, folks, looking ahead, time for that.
Okay, well, Monday is Martin Luther King Day, and there's going to be the usual parade, which is going to end at South Claiborne and Felicity Street, which is where the Martin Luther King statue is. And this year they've added something new. They've added a board, a type of display, where people can go and they can write down slogans or leave photos or memories, just to sort of embellish the area. And it'll be dedicated this Monday.
All right, Errol, thanks. Richard?
One thing to watch for after the City Council resolves what to do on the potential smoking ban, I think, is whether they take up the sound ordinance next. And a lot of people maybe had thought that had been dormant since last year, since it had kind of been shelved with a lot of opposition from some musicians and bar owners. But it sounds like that could be the next thing to come down the pike.
All right, Richard. Don?
February 1st, the Greater New Orleans Sports Foundation and Sugar Bowl Committee will be looking at the bid specifications for the college football championship game. So wait for news on that to see if those are games the city can bid on.
Okay, thanks. Mark?
2015 is going to be the year of the courtroom for a lot of the legal issues involving environmental stuff in the state, especially the lawsuit filed by the Levee Authority, and also the 28 lawsuits filed by Jefferson and Plaquemines Parish against oil and gas industries. So keep tracks on that. By March, we should see some key issues addressed.
Okay, an important trial beginning next week in BP too, and how it will impact the coast, because it can. Thanks a lot, folks, for being here. Thank you all so much for joining us, and of course we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.